On the night of the 28th of May, 1453, two great crowds lay awake on either side of a single wall, and almost no one slept. Inside the wall was the city of Constantinople, and inside the city, in a vast church crowned with a dome that had hung over the skyline for 900 years, thousands of people were gathered by candlelight. For this one night, old and bitter divisions were set aside. Greeks and Latins, Orthodox and Catholic, who had spent centuries quarreling over their faith, stood together and prayed as one. Soldiers came straight from the walls, still in their armor, took communion, and then walked back out into the dark to their posts. Many of them knew they would not see another night. Outside the wall, across the ditches and the fields, stretched a sea of tents and campfires, the army of the Ottoman Sultan, tens of thousands of men. There, too, people were awake. Soldiers sharpened weapons and made their own prayers. And somewhere in that camp, the largest cannon the world had ever seen was being made ready for dawn. Two peoples, two faiths, one wall between them, both awake, both praying to God for the morning to come. By the time the sun set again, one of them would have their answer. A city that had stood for more than 1,100 years, the last living piece of the Roman Empire, would either survive one more day or fall forever. This is the story of that night, and of how the whole weight of 1,000 years came down to a single wall, a single dawn, and the men waiting on both sides of it. To understand what was at stake that night, you first have to understand what Constantinople had been. More than 1,000 years earlier, in the year 330, the Roman Emperor Constantine had refounded an old Greek town on the edge of Europe and Asia and made it his new capital. He called it New Rome. The world came to call it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. When the western half of the Roman Empire collapsed into the chaos of the early Middle Ages, this eastern half lived on, ruled from this city. We now call it the Byzantine Empire, but its own people never stopped calling themselves Romans. For centuries, Constantinople was simply the greatest city in the Christian world. It sat astride the waterway between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, controlling trade between whole continents, and it grew fabulously rich. At its heart stood Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, its dome so wide and so high that visitors said it seemed to float on light. To much of medieval Europe, this was the closest thing on earth to a heavenly city. Within its walls lived scholars, merchants, and craftsmen from across the known world, and its markets overflowed with silk, spices, and gold. For centuries, when medieval Europeans pictured wealth and splendor, they pictured Constantinople. For 1,000 years, it was the anchor of an entire civilization. But the city that held its breath in 1453 was only a ghost of that empire. And to understand why, you have to see how far it had already fallen. By the 15th century, the Roman Empire of the East had been dying for a long time. It had been battered from every direction, by wars, by plagues, by the slow loss of its provinces. And one of the deepest wounds had come, astonishingly, from its fellow Christians. In 1204, an army of Western Crusaders, meant to be marching to the Holy Land, instead turned on Constantinople itself, stormed the city, and sacked it with terrible violence, carrying off its treasures. The empire never fully recovered from that betrayal. By 1453, what had once been a superpower spanning 3 continents had shrunk to almost nothing, little more than the city itself and a few scattered lands. Around it, a new power had risen and grown until it nearly surrounded the old capital, the Ottoman Empire. And the city itself had emptied out. Constantinople had been built to hold perhaps 500,000 people or more. Now, maybe 50,000 remained, living among gardens, fields, and ruins inside walls that had once contained a metropolis. Whole districts stood abandoned. It was a vast, half-empty shell, still wearing the crown of an empire that had, in truth, almost ceased to exist. The men who had once ruled the world from this city had watched their realm contract, decade by decade, until the emperor of the Romans governed little more than what he could see from his own walls. And yet it had survived, again and again, for one simple reason. No one had ever been able to get through its walls. The walls of Constantinople were the most famous fortifications in the world, and with good reason. On the landward side, where no water protected the city, stood the Theodosian Walls, built 1,000 years earlier. They were not a single barrier, but a system in depth. A wide moat, then a low outer wall, then a terrace, then a towering inner wall studded with great towers. An attacker who somehow crossed the moat and broke the outer wall would find himself trapped in a killing ground beneath the inner one. For 1,000 years, these walls had done their work. Wave after wave of enemies had come, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and rival armies of every kind, and had broken against these stones and gone home. The walls were the reason a city that should have fallen many times over was still standing. They had become almost a thing of legend, as though the city were protected by something more than stone. Twice, centuries before, great Arab armies had besieged the city for years and failed to take it. Avars, Persians, and others had tried and been turned back. In more than 1,000 years, the land walls had been breached by a besieging army only once, during that Christian sack of 1204, and never by an outside empire. The people of Constantinople trusted those walls the way you trust the ground beneath your feet. But the young man in the tents outside had brought something to this siege that none of those earlier armies had possessed, and it was about to make 1,000 years of walls suddenly obsolete. The army outside the walls was led by a 21-year-old. His name was Mehmed II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He was young, but he was no novice. He was highly educated, spoke several languages, studied history and science, and had been fascinated since boyhood by this one city. Taking Constantinople had been the dream of Muslim rulers for centuries, and many had tried and failed. Mehmed intended to be the one who succeeded. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, brilliant, patient, and utterly determined, capable of great vision and great ruthlessness alike. He did not see the conquest of Constantinople merely as the destruction of an enemy. He saw the city as a prize, meant to become the heart of his own empire, a capital worthy of a world power. And he even saw himself, in a sense, as an heir to the Roman legacy the city still carried. For Mehmed, this was not just a battle. It was the founding act of the empire he meant to build. He had also prepared the ground with care. The year before the siege, Mehmed had built a great fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, at its narrowest point, directly across from an older Ottoman fort on the Asian side. Between them, his guns could now close the strait and cut Constantinople off from the Black Sea and any help that might sail down it. The Byzantines called the new fortress the Throat Cutter. The message was unmistakable. And to break the unbreakable walls, he had gone looking for a weapon equal to the task. He had found it, strangely enough, in a man the Byzantines had turned away. Some time before the siege, a cannon founder had come to Constantinople looking for work. His name was Orban, and he offered the emperor something remarkable: the ability to cast enormous guns, far larger than anything then in common use. But the Byzantine treasury was nearly empty. and the emperor could not pay what Orban asked. So Orban left and took his offer to the young Ottoman sultan instead. Mehmed gave him everything he wanted. What Orban built was a monster. His greatest cannon was around 8 meters long, a giant bronze tube that could hurl a stone ball weighing more than half a ton across a distance of more than a mile. It was so massive that it took teams of oxen and hundreds of men to drag it into position, and it could be fired only a handful of times a day. But when it struck, it did what no siege weapon in history had done to these walls. It broke them. Day after day, the great guns pounded the Theodosian Walls, and slowly, painfully, sections that had stood for 1,000 years began to crack and crumble. Each night, the defenders rushed out to repair the damage with rubble and timber and barrels of earth. Each day, the guns tore it open again. The sound of the great gun, it was said, could be heard for miles, and the ground shuddered when it fired. For the people inside, each distant boom was a reminder that the one thing they had always trusted, their walls, was being taken from them, stone by stone. The age of the great walls was ending, and everyone on both sides could hear it, in the thunder that rolled across the city with every shot. The bombardment was only part of it. Through the spring of 1453, Mehmed tightened his grip on the city from every side. Constantinople's one great natural harbor was a deep inlet called the Golden Horn, and its entrance was sealed by an enormous iron chain stretched across the water, blocking any fleet from sailing in. For weeks it held. The Ottoman ships could not force their way through. So Mehmed did something audacious. If his ships could not go through the chain, they would go around it, over dry land. On greased wooden rollers, his men hauled dozens of warships up and over the hills behind the harbor, and slid them down into the Golden Horn on the far side of the chain. One morning, the defenders looked out and saw an Ottoman fleet floating in waters they had believed were sealed. Now the city was threatened along its sea walls too, and its small band of defenders had to stretch even thinner to cover them. Inside the city, the defenders waited desperately for help from the great Christian powers of the West. A few ships and a few hundred men had come, but the great rescue, the fleet and army that might have saved them, never arrived. Constantinople would face the storm very nearly alone. Week by week, the circle closed, and by late May, both sides knew the waiting was almost over. Consider for a moment the odds those defenders faced. Against an army of tens of thousands, perhaps 70 or 80,000 strong, the city could field only around 7,000 fighting men. Many were not even Byzantine. There were Genoese and Venetian volunteers, Italians who had chosen to stay and fight for a city that was not their own. Their most important soldier was a Genoese commander named Giovanni Giustiniani, an expert in siege warfare, who took charge of the defense of the crucial land walls. And at the center of it all was the emperor himself, Constantine XI, the last in a line of Roman emperors reaching back in an almost unbroken thread some 15 centuries. He had been offered chances to flee, to save himself and rule from somewhere safe. He refused. He would stay with his city and share whatever came. 7,000 men, spread thin along miles of wall, holding the last fragment of the Roman world against one of the most powerful armies on earth. They knew exactly what they were facing. Most of them stayed anyway. And in those last days, the city was full of dread and strange signs. There had been a lunar eclipse, and an old prophecy held that the city could only fall under a waning moon. During a solemn procession, an icon of the Virgin, the city's protector, is said to have slipped from the hands that carried it. And one night, an eerie light was seen playing around the dome of Hagia Sophia, which some read as a sign of divine favor, and others as the sign of God's own spirit leaving the city. Whatever they truly were, the defenders took them as warnings. And so, on the night of the 28th of May, with the walls broken in places and the final assault clearly coming, the city gathered to pray. That night is the reason this story has never been forgotten. With the great cannon fallen silent and the Ottoman camp preparing for the morning, the people of Constantinople came together inside Hagia Sophia. For centuries, the Orthodox Greeks of the city and the Catholic Latins had been divided by a deep religious rift, at times refusing even to worship in the same building. On this last night, that was set aside. Priests of both traditions led the service side by side. Soldiers, sailors, women, children, and the emperor himself all crowded beneath the great dome in the candlelight and prayed together for their city. By the accounts that come down to us, the Emperor Constantine went among his commanders and made a final address, asking them to be ready to die if it came to that, for their faith, their families, and their home. Then the defenders went back to the broken walls and took their places in the dark. And across the ditch, the Ottoman soldiers made their own preparations and their own prayers, calling on the same God in a different tongue for victory in the morning. Then everything went quiet. For a few hours, the greatest city of the medieval world held its breath and waited for the light. When it came with a roar. So final assault began in the darkness before dawn on the 29th of May. Mehmed sent his men forward in waves. First the irregulars, then his regular Anatolian troops, and finally his elite soldiers, the Janissaries, hurling themselves at the broken sections of the wall, while the defenders fought them off at fearful cost. For hours, the outnumbered defenders held. The battle hung genuinely in the balance. The fighting in those final hours was savage and close, hand to hand along the ramparts and in the breaches, in the gray half-light before dawn. Then two things broke against them. The Genoese commander, Giustiniani, was badly wounded and carried from the wall, and his departure shook the men fighting beside him. And somewhere along the defenses, the attackers found a way through and got inside, and their banners began to appear on the towers. Once the defenders saw the enemy behind them as well as in front, the line came apart. Later legend blamed a single small gate left unlocked, but most historians now doubt that. The deeper cause was simply too few men, holding too much wall against too many. The Emperor Constantine, by the most enduring account, tore off the imperial insignia that set him apart, so that he would fall not as an emperor, but as an ordinary soldier, and charged into the fighting. He was never reliably seen again, and his body was never certainly identified. After 15 centuries, the last Roman emperor simply vanished into the fall of his own city. What followed was, by the harsh custom of the age, 3 days given over to plunder. For those who lived through it, it was the end of their world. By the evening of the 29th of May, 1453, Constantinople had fallen, and the Roman Empire, after more than 1,000 years, was gone. Later that day, Mehmed II rode into the conquered city. He made his way to Hagia Sophia, the church that had been the heart of Eastern Christianity for 900 years, and ordered that it be turned into a mosque. Within days, Muslim prayers were being offered beneath its ancient dome. Constantinople would become the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and in time, it would be known by the name it still carries, Istanbul. Mehmed, just 21, had earned the title history would give him. the conqueror. The shock of the city's fall rolled outward across the world. In Christian Europe, it landed like the end of an age, and in a strange way, it helped open a new one. Greek scholars who fled the fall carried ancient manuscripts westward and are often credited with helping feed the flowering of the Renaissance. And with the old land routes to the east now firmly in Ottoman hands, Europeans began searching harder for a sea route to Asia, a search that within a few decades would send ships across oceans and redraw the entire map of the world. For the Ottomans, it was a founding triumph. The moment their state became a true empire astride two continents. For the Greek world, it became a wound that never fully closed, remembered and mourned for centuries afterward. As for the city's last hours, they passed into legend. The Greeks told of an emperor turned to marble, sleeping until the day he would rise and take the city back, and of a priest who stepped into the wall of Hagia Sophia mid-prayer and would one day step out to finish it. These are stories, not history, born of a grief too large to accept. And the walls, the great walls that finally failed after 1,000 years, still stand along the edge of Istanbul today, worn and broken in places, but there. Walk beside them, and it is not hard to imagine that last night. The candlelight in the great church. The two armies awake in the dark, and a whole world waiting to see what the dawn would bring. Two peoples once prayed on either side of that wall for the morning to come. When it came, it ended one empire and began another. And no one who lived through that night ever forgot it.